If you have joined me for any of my recent stitch alongs, then you've already heard my little speech about transferring the pattern from the printed pattern onto dark fabric. So if you already know how to do that and you've heard this speech before, then you can just skip to the next part. All right, lucky you. If you are new to either my stitch alongs or to transferring a pattern onto dark fabric, here is the method I'm going to use. I have a full-length video about how to do this, so I will play that in just a minute. But the short version about how to do this is to have your pattern printed up and cut out and ready to go, your fabric stretched in the hoop. I'm going to be using white graphite paper and then a pen to trace it from the carbon onto the fabric, and then I'm going to go over it with the white gel pen. That was the super, super short version about how to do this. So let me play the video for you now that is more detailed. I go into everything. It's not for this pattern, it's a different pattern, but it's the same concept. It's a very accurate way of transferring a design onto fabric, onto dark fabric. And especially with a pattern like this that has a lot of complicated lines, you know, there's a chance that I could probably use the tracing method the bright light method where I put the pattern behind and I shine a light behind here and then trace it on. I could probably see through this, even though it's like a plum color. I could probably see through it, but there's a lot going on with this one, and I want to make sure I get everything traced accurately. So I'm using the graphite paper method. So I'm going to play that for you now, so watch through that video if this is a new process for you. Hello, Stitchers! This is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to this tutorial about how to transfer an embroidery design onto dark fabric. Now, if you're like 95% of the people out there, you don't really like to transfer patterns onto the fabric. I know, I get it. It's tedious. I'm the same way. I just want to get to the fun part with the pretty threads and the fun stitches and all the pretty colors. But you got to get a pattern on there somehow, right? And the method that I use most of the time when I'm using a light colored fabric is to, I'll just quickly go over that method, is to print out the fabric, print out the design, cut it out, stretch my fabric on the hoop, tape the pattern behind the hoop, and then shine a bright light behind it and trace it on. And you can very easily see, even a kind of an intricate pattern like this, you can see all these dark lines and you can trace it onto the front of your fabric. But if you have a fabric that is a little bit different, that you cannot see the lines through the fabric if you shine a light behind it, you need to use a different method. And I found this method to be very accurate, and it just has a couple of steps to it, and so it's not that hard, and it works really well. So let me talk about the fabric first of all. This is the one I'm going to be using today is a quilting cotton, but it's this gray. And I could probably get by with tracing it on with a bright light, but I just wanted to make sure that I got all this detail and I wasn't struggling too much. So that's why I'm using this method. If you are using, like, stitching on a linen fabric is really, really wonderful, but it presents a couple of issues. It tends to be a little bit thicker sometimes, and it very often will have a texture to it. And that kind of nubby texture can present a problem when you're trying to shine a light through it from behind and see through it, because all that texture shows up as all these crisscross lines and it interferes with you seeing these lines. So, like, here's a linen that is dark, so it has sort of a double whammy. It's dark, well, triple whammy. It's dark, it's a little bit thicker, and it has the texture. But even on a linen like this one, which is a light color, if this was just in a regular cotton fabric, this color would not be any problem at all to shine the light behind it and trace. But it is thicker, and if you can see how it has that very textured, nubby effect to it, that's going to be really almost impossible. You're just not going to be able to see a pattern from behind with a bright light. So let's use this method. The supplies you will need: the fabric, obviously, a hoop. You will need a ballpoint pen. You'll need a white gel pen. You'll need the pattern printed onto paper. And you will need white graphite paper. And this is like an artist's graphite paper. It is used to transfer line work onto wood or metal or paper. And it's I will probably refer to it as carbon paper half the time. So, but anyway, technically the package says graphite paper, and it works just like a carbon paper. It has the paper side, and then on the other side it has, um, it's almost like a waxy, chalky, you know, coating on it. So let me talk briefly about, just very quickly, let me talk about the hoop. I carry these hoops in my shop. I love them. They're so nice. They have really nice brass hardware, and that's what the screwdriver is here for, so that when I'm tightening my fabric, I can put the screwdriver in there and I can tighten it down really tightly. And that is important because you want your fabric stretched very tightly. I know this isn't about fabric stretching, but let me just get my plug in here for always making sure your fabric is stretched super, super tight in the hoop. That makes everything easier. Tracing or transferring the pattern on will be more accurate. Your stitches will be more accurate, and you won't constantly be tugging on the fabric. And so using a good quality hoop can help that. Also, if you notice, I have the inside of this hoop wrapped with cotton twill tape. And cotton is important because you don't want it to be something slick. But I've just wrapped it and I've hot glued it here on both ends. And I've just made sure it's smooth all the way around. And then what that does is that allows the inner and outer hoops to squeeze the fabric more tightly, and it gives this inner hoop a little bit more grip. That's why you don't want to use like a shiny ribbon. So that once I pull it tight, this way, and then I stretch it, and then I tighten it right here, that fabric stays like a drum the entire time I'm working. So no more struggling to keep my fabric tight. So let's get down to the details about exactly how to do this process. And I have now stretched my fabric in the hoop, and you can see that it is absolutely as tight as it can be. I've also trimmed it off, and I have used pinking shears, scalloped pinking shears, to trim off the fabric so that all that fabric doesn't get in my way and so it doesn't unravel. And I have cut out my pattern, and I have also cut out a circle of carbon paper. And the size that you want to do is you're going to flip the hoop over and figure out a size that fits right inside the hoop. And you don't really want it to climb up the edges. And you also want to make sure that it is big enough that it covers all the way to the edge of where your design goes. So this one works out that if I just kind of do it just a teeny, let me get this out of here. Once you cut this out, cut this circle out, you can cut this circle just a little tiny bit smaller than this circle. So now that I have those, the method is there's my top, and I'm going to place the graphite paper onto the back side, or well, onto this side of the fabric. And let me talk quickly here. I like to stitch with my fabric, with my hoop and my fabric facing up like this. Some people are happy stitching like this. It doesn't really matter. It's whatever works for you. But I just generally prefer to have my fabric facing like this as I'm stitching. But when I am transferring the design with this method, I need to flip it over so that I can have this on a hard surface, so that when I am tracing this design, I can press down really hard. If I was tracing it like this and I press down, the fabric, even though it's really tight, it has a little bit of give to it, and I'm not going to get as good of a transfer. So for now, I'm going to transfer it like this. After it's all finished, all transferred, I will flip the fabric this way, and then I'll begin stitching. So first step, flip the hoop over. Take your carbon paper, and you'll need to figure out which side is which side is the graphite side and which is the paper side. And if you just feel it with your fingers, this side, the graphite side, has a little bit of it's not sticky, but it's just a little bit, tiny bit waxy. And this side is real smooth, and your finger glides right over it. So those creases won't matter. So I'm going to just place that centered like that, making sure it's right in the center. And now I'm going to take my, also let me show you this. This is a previous piece of graphite paper that I have used, And you can reuse these. You know, it will still, the more you use it, the less of the graphite is going to transfer. But maybe you can, I don't know if you can see that, hopefully, but you can see how I've got at least, I think I've used this one at least twice. And you can see how the design they just trace right over each other. And it worked out fine. I could probably get, maybe depending on how dense the design was that I was tracing, I could maybe get one or two more transfers out of this. So don't feel like you have to use this and then toss this one and use it again. You can keep using this until it's just not showing up anymore. But for this demonstration, I wanted you to really be able to see what I was doing. So I'm using a fresh piece of graphite paper. Now I'm taking my printed design and I'm going to lay it on top. And I am picky about how my transfer, I think it goes just like that. I like it to be centered. I know it's just a thing with me. So I am centering that, and now with the pattern facing up, now there's one other supply I forgot to tell you you're going to need, and that is just 3 or 4 pieces of this tape, because I need to tape this in place. So I'm going to put it on the paper, rub my finger, rub it on the inside of the hoop, the top of the hoop, and then stick it onto the paper. I just don't want this to shift while I am tracing. And I'm going to try not to cover up too much of the lines, although it doesn't really matter. You could cover that with the tape and it's just not going to really get in the way. But, 3 pieces is plenty. I just have made sure that I have, right here, I've really pressed it down hard onto the fabric, and I've pressed it down really hard on the inside of the hoop and on the top. If I just kind of slapped a piece of tape on there, then this could still shift a little bit, and you don't want it shifting. You want it to stay in place the whole time you are working. For the next step, you're going to need a little bit of hand strength, because what we're going to do is we're going to use our ballpoint pen to trace over these black lines, and we're going to push hard enough so that the graphite, transfers onto the fabric. Now the fabric, even though it's a smooth fabric, it's just a teensy bit rough, and you're going to feel that as you're tracing. And the reason we're using a ballpoint pen is because it has a rounded, a ball point, and so you can push really hard, but it's not going to tear the paper. You could probably use a pencil, but if I had a pencil that was like super sharp that I just sharpened and I was pressing really hard, first of all, I might break off the tip of the pencil, and I might also tear the paper. So that's why a ballpoint, just a regular old cheapy ballpoint pen, is great for this. And I printed this out in black, and I have done it before where if you have access to printing your own patterns, on your printer, I switch the color. I either reduce the opacity or I make it like a very light pink so that when I am tracing, I can see where I've traced. But I didn't do that here. That's fine, not a problem. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold this down and I'm going to trace over the lines, pressing very, very firmly. Okay, I'm really pressing down hard. And I've traced over these lines. I'm going to trace over everything on here, and the reason that I sometimes print it in a different color, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell where you have traced or where you have not traced. But just take a good look at it after you trace everything with the ballpoint pen. It also helps. I'm using a blue ballpoint so I can tell what's blue versus black. But I'm going to take a really hard look at it after I've traced all of these lines, pressing down very firmly, which is why, like I said, I needed it to be flipped this way so I could really press down hard. Trace over all your lines, take a good hard look at it, make sure you've traced over everything, and then we will move on to the next step. One other quick note that I wanted to mention before I move on is that the surface, the table underneath, is important too, because you are pressing so hard, and it's just going through this fabric, you don't want to, you want to have a nice hard surface underneath your hoop. If you're using this pen and pressing down really hard, and if you have like a wooden table, you could easily leave, an indentation in that wooden table. And this is actually a piece of like almost like foam core, and it's sort of soft. And if I were to proceed, I would not do it on here. I'm going to move this and I'm going to use my work table that has a really nice hard surface that's not going to be ruined by pressing really hard as I trace all of these lines. All the lines are traced with the ballpoint pen, but before I just rip off this paper and the carbon or the graphite paper, I'm going to do a little check first. I'm going to carefully lift up the edge here, and sometimes it's hard to get your fingernail under there, so I just am using a needle. And I'm going to pull up both the graphite paper and the printed pattern, and I'm going to check to see if my lines did transfer. And I'm going to put my hand behind it so you can see, so it's dark. So hopefully see those lines right there. They're very faint, but they're there. So that tells me that I put the graphite paper down with the correct side down, and that I pressed hard enough to see those lines. And now I will go ahead and take off the paper, the printed pattern, and the graphite paper. Now that I've taken off the pattern and the graphite paper, there's all of my lines that have been transferred on. But there's one more step I need to do. I need to go over those lines with the white gel pen. And the reason is, yes, I can see these, especially if you put something dark behind it, so there's no light shining behind it. So yes, I can see these lines, but they are a little bit faint. And if you wanted to start stitching right now, you could definitely do that. This graphite doesn't, it sort of rubs off. It's not like chalk where it's going to just completely disappear if you like barely rub it. But it's pretty light, and I don't want to struggle the whole time I'm stitching this to see those faint lines. And particularly as you get more stitches on, it's a little hard to see the fainter lines next to what you're stitching. So I like to go over it with the white gel pen. Let me talk to you for just a moment about the white gel pen. These are great. It's an opaque ink, so that's why it shows up on dark fabrics. They're great for paper as well, but they can be a little bit finicky. So when I store these, I store them with the tip down so that the ink is always down here in the tip. If you store it up, it can kind of go down to the other end of the pen, and it's kind of hard to get that ink flowing. And talking about getting the ink flowing, I always keep a little piece of, it doesn't have to be the same color of fabric, and it could even be a piece of paper, but if you have a little scrap of the same fabric that you're stitching on, that works too. So before I get going, I will make a few lines, and you can see that it's not showing up really great at the beginning. So if you kind of keep making some lines, it gets a little bit brighter as you are working with it. And sometimes as I'm tracing over those lines, I will come back over here, or I'll wipe the tip off because that ink can get a little bit dry. But generally, if you store them with the tip down, they work pretty well, and I don't have a whole lot of trouble with them. So now all there is to do is just carefully go over the lines that I traced with the graphite paper. And sometimes I will go over the lines twice if I really want it to be brighter, a brighter white. And at first you might not think that it's really tracing, or it's not making much of a difference. But if you compare it to the kind of light lines that were left from the graphite paper, you can definitely see that it's brighter. And once I've gone over all these lines, I have never had any trouble being able to see it while I'm stitching. So let me bring that up to you so you can see it. So see the difference between the graphite lines and the gel pen lines. So it's really worth just a little bit of time to go over it with the white gel pen. Another consideration of the white gel pen is that it is permanent. Neither the graphite lines or the gel pen lines are going to wash out. They're not going to disappear with time, and you can't use heat to get them out. They are permanent. So I trace very carefully, and I mean here I flubbed up, but it's not going to matter. It's all going to be covered with stitching. But if I have like a line where the stem is going to be, I make sure to trace very carefully, both with the graphite paper and now again with the gel pen, so that I am going to be able to stitch over that line and cover it completely throughout the whole pattern while I'm stitching, because these lines will not go away. All right. Phew. I am glad that is done. If you are someone that transferred this pattern onto this fabric using this method, then give yourself a pat on the back, because I will admit it took a little while. It's a little bit, there's a lot to do on this one. It's got a lot of detail. So I am glad we are done with this part. Because I am someone who likes to stitch with my fabric facing this direction in the hoop, I am going to take this fabric out and flip it and re-stretch it in the hoop. And once I do that, we will be ready to start stitching. These little leafy sprigs are very straightforward and pretty simple. They only use 2 stitches. And they're a great way to kind of warm up again, if you kind of get your brain and your hands and your eyes kind of all in sync again. I know no matter how much I stitch, sometimes when I sit down, if it's been a little bit, or even if it's just been since yesterday, sometimes I just need some kind of straightforward, simple stitching to get everything back in sync. So this is a great way to do that. The 2 stitches we're going to be using for this are the split back stitch for the stem and the leaf stitch, or the fishbone stitch, for these leaves. The split back stitch for the stem, if you've done any of my other stitch alongs, you know that's one of my favorite stitches to use for just simple lines like this. It has a nice compact, makes a nice compact line, but it has a little bit of interest to it because of these sort of like little tiny, it looks like a little tiny chain stitch. The only thing about split back stitch is that it can be just a teeny bit of a thread hog. So if you are either running out of thread or want to conserve thread a little bit, then sometimes I will switch to the split stitch as opposed to the split back stitch. You wouldn't think there'd be much of a difference in the thread, but actually there is. So even sometimes if I am, coming up here, and if I'm getting to the end of the line and I'm about to run out of thread and I may not have enough thread, if I'm doing the split back stitch, I will switch to split stitch and I will make it to the end of the line with the thread I have left, and they look virtually the same. So if you just ever need to save thread by the time you get to the end of the line, just switch over to split stitch. Now, as far as the fishbone stitch for these leaves, this is a very common stitch for leaves, and you can see why, because it gives this very nice leafy effect with a kind of a vein down the middle formed by the, the texture of the stitches where the stitch goes in. But most often I see it on leaves that are very symmetrical. They're very even, and they're the same on both sides, similar to this one. And I'll talk a little bit more about symmetrical versus asymmetrical in just a minute, because I'll do this leaf too, which is not symmetrical. But let me start with this one and just show you how to do it. You always start at the top, the very tip of the leaf. And so because of that, I like to orient my hoop so that my leaf is always straight up and down like this. You can obviously do this stitch with the leaf facing that way. I just am more comfortable. My brain works better when the leaf is vertical like this. So I'm always going to start at the tip, and I pull up my thread so it's a little bit past this little tip. And I will say throughout this whole stitch, and really all stitching, but when I bring my needle up, I'm going to make sure that I come up outside this white line, my pattern line, because if I come up right on that line and then pull the stitch this way, it's going to let a little bit of that white line show, and I want to cover that all the way up. So when I bring my needle up for the whole rest of these stitches and for this first one right here, I'm going to make sure that I come up outside the white line, the pattern line. But anyway, back to the actual fishbone stitch. I come up outside of the tip of the leaf, and I'm going to take a stitch, make a stitch, a straight stitch down the center. Now, how long you make this stitch does inform what the rest of the leaf looks like. If I was working on a very long leaf or a larger leaf, I would make this stitch quite a bit longer. What this does, the length of this stitch, it will determine what the angle of the rest of the stitches are on the leaf. So if I were to make a really long leaf, let me show you why. Let me go ahead and start and I'll show you why. Make one stitch, come up and then down in the center, make one straight stitch, and then come up on either side of the tip, the top of that stitch you just made, and go down right at the bottom of that stitch. Then you're going to come up on the other side of that stitch and go down in the center. Hop over to the other side and make a stitch down in the center. And you just do the whole rest of the leaf the very same way, jumping back and forth, left to right. It doesn't matter if after you make that first initial stitch, it doesn't matter if you come up on the right or left. It just doesn't matter. Just do whichever one you want. And always go down right in the center. Now I know it was a little hard to see at the beginning there when those stitches were so tiny, so let me get a little bit more of this leaf done. So you can see what I'm talking about the angle of those stitches. And also, you know, if you do these stitches very close together, like I am doing, you'll have a very solidly filled in leaf. You can, if you wanted, you could get a different look with this stitch by separating each of these stitches a little bit. You know, give it a little bit of room and you have a more airy looking leaf, but I want a solid leaf here. So I'm making sure to come up right next to the stitch right there. Okay, so now maybe you can kind of see what I'm talking about the angle. So if I had made a really long first initial stitch, like if it came all the way down to here, then my angle of each of these stitches would have been much sharper. Nothing wrong with that. That would be fine. These are just very kind of short, squatty leaves. You know, they're kind of short and pudgy this way, you know, this way and this way. And I didn't want a sharply angled leaf. I actually wanted the angles on both sides to be a little more like this as opposed to a sharp angle like that. And it gives me more stitches, which gives a little bit more of a visual line as you come down here. But like I said, if your angle is a little bit sharper, a little bit steeper, that's fine. But it all kind of is based on that first initial stitch that you take there at the tip. So just keep stitching down, going down in the center. And I'll finish this one up and then we will hop over to that next leaf and talk about a leaf that is perhaps not quite so symmetrical. So even though this leaf right here is asymmetrical, and you can see I've turned my hoop again so that now this leaf is generally vertical, even though this one is asymmetrical, you do this exactly the same as you did before. You're just going to trust the outline of your pattern. So same thing as before, take that first stitch like that, and now, as I said, just pull that through back there. Those little fuzzies came through, hang on. All right, so now just trust the pattern lines. So even though this line right here, the center line is curved, just when you go down, just follow that curve. When you come up on the outside of this line or on the outside of this line, trust the line, just come up right outside that line. And so obviously this side is going to be much skinnier, this side is going to be wider, but it's the exact same thing. And if you just follow the lines, just like you do all the time when you stitch, your leaf will come out asymmetrical. I mean, that's really all there is to it. That part dips in really far right there. This one is still way up here a little bit. Like that. And now on this side, it kind of starts to widen out. And just as before, since I made a shorter initial first stitch, the angle on each of these stitches is not very steep as I go down. All right, now it's getting much wider right here. And when you get to the very end, the bottom, not the end, but the bottom of the leaf down here, you may end up very often on these, if you can see that, like I will end up doing more stitches on one side than I do on the other. But really just fill in, that's okay, but that's fine by that time, even though you're not going right and left. Just keep filling in until the whole shape is filled in. But that's all there is to doing an asymmetrical leaf, and I really like the way it looks. I mean, I kind of get tired of every leaf looking exactly alike. I like them to be a little bit more organic. So the angles on this one are coming out really flatter than some of the other ones, but that's fine. We'll just take a few more stitches to fill this one up, but that's okay. But that is all there is to the very popular fishbone stitch. I think sometimes it's referred to as the leaf stitch. Oh, and I think I forgot to say that I am using 3 strands of thread for these leaves. Okay, so there you go. That's all there is to it. For these little 4-petaled flowers, or I don't know what to call them, they're kind of like hydrangea, flowers, but they're not hydrangeas, so I'll probably just end up calling them something boring like 4-petal flowers. So there you go. We are going to use 3 strands of thread. There's 3. And we're going to use a satin stitch to fill them in. Now, I would not be a very effective teacher if I just said, fill in with a satin stitch, because it's just not quite that simple. And especially if there are any of you out there who have struggled with satin stitch or don't like satin stitch because it doesn't ever turn out right. And I'm going to suspect there's at least a couple of you, if not many, many of you, that fall into that category. I was in that category once myself too. But I would not be a good teacher if I didn't give you a little bit more information. So let me explain what I'm talking about. At its most basic, satin stitch is just stitches that sit next to each other. Like just make a straight stitch and then make a stitch next to it, and they just sit right next to each other. That's it at its most basic, but there's more to it than that. There are 2 types, there's 2 categories of satin stitching that I break them up into. One of them is called what I call parallel satin stitching, and then one of them is satin stitching in an arc. And that is what we are going to be doing on this petal, satin stitching in an arc, because these stitches, while they do sit side by side, they are going to fan out. They're going to go from here all the way around to this petal. And so if you think about it, this petal has a very tiny amount of space down here, but all around this edge you have to fit enough stitches to fill all the way around here. The stitches have to be close together, and they're all gonna go in this direction, and they're all gonna end up here. But I have a tiny space here and a lot of space up here to fill up. So how do I do that without these stitches, like there being this huge, chaotic, crowded mass of stitches up here at this narrow end? Well, let me show you how to do that. I'm going to start over here on the left side, and I could start out here way on this end, like all the way out here. you know, these are kind of crammed up next to the petal next to them. So if you want to start out here, that's fine. Sometimes on this one, on these, I start a little bit closer in, but that's just a very minor detail. And I am going to take that stitch down in the center of the petal, right, towards the middle. I'm going to come out a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead, I kind of use that little stitch to just fill in a little bit right down there. So now I'm going to come out here. I'm going to start my first, you know, complete stitch on the outside edge, and I am going to go down here in the center. But I am not going to go all the way to the center. I am going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to put this stitch not quite as long as it would take to get all the way to that middle. So I'm going to sort of put it underneath that stitch I already made. So that one, that's kind of a wonky looking satin stitch, but it's going to all come out in the end, I promise. So I'm going to make another stitch, take my time to come up outside the edge of the white line, but also right next to the stitch I just made. So I'm going to make this one a complete stitch, you know, one full length stitch. I'm going to go down in the center. Right? Now I'm going to do the same thing, come out on the outside, but this time again, instead of going all the way and making a full length stitch, I'm going to make a stitch that is slightly shorter, and I'm going to go a little bit underneath that long stitch that I just made. So this one I'm going to come a little bit short right there, you know, come back from the middle of the flower. And now I'm going to come back out to the outside edge. This time I'm going to make it even shorter. I'm still going to go underneath. You know, I don't want to go down into the stitches because that would show. I'm going to make sure the needle, the tip of the needle goes underneath the stitch that I just made, and it's even shorter than the previous one. Now for this next stitch, I am going to go ahead and make almost a full length stitch. Maybe not quite to the very middle of the flower. So that one, those strands need to be straightened out a little bit. I'm just pulling it from the back. All right, now I'm going to come back out to the outside edge, and I'm going to start that again. Make a slightly shorter stitch that's underneath the stitch I just made. Make this one maybe not quite full length. All right, so now I am to this point of this petal, and for the point of these petals I always make sure I do a full length stitch. I come up, I go ahead and make sure I come out plenty far past the point of my pattern line. All right, so that point is really a nice sharp point, and I make a straight stitch right down the center all the way to the middle. So for these petals, the middle stitch, I always make sure it is a long, straight, complete, full stitch. All right, so what I'm doing here, you may ask, is that a lot of times, sometimes these strands, they get twisted like that, or one strand gets pulled more than another, and when you pull it through, one of them is sitting up, you know, higher than the others, or they get twisted. And I want these to sit, I want all three of these strands to sit right next to each other so that they are side by side, parallel to each other, the strands. And when they get all twisted up, sometimes you have to give them a little bit of help. So what I'm doing is from the back, I'm grabbing those threads. This is called, I'm using my needle as a laying tool. And you can buy a separate tool to do this, but I just use the needle I have in hand. So I'm grabbing the strands of thread on the back, and I'm pulling them, and I'm putting my needle underneath that loop of thread, and I'm sort of pulling, I'm kind of seesawing back and forth. And as I'm seesawing, I am, you know, running that needle back and forth this way, and that gets those strands to really line up, to sit parallel to each other instead of being twisted. And as I'm doing that, I'm pulling from the back, and as I pull out my needle, and now those strands are really nice and flat. So if you ever have strands that just are not behaving, use your needle as a laying tool, and you can get those strands to behave. So now I have done a full length stitch right down the center. I'm going to go back to doing a just almost full length, but not quite. Well, those really wanted to tangle up, didn't they? Look, really got tangled. Okay. All right. But that one was a little bit shorter, almost full length. I'm going to come back a little bit and make one a little bit shorter underneath the stitch before it. Maybe go almost to the center on that one. You kind of just have to judge how often to make these short stitches. On some, you know, other designs, not this one so much, but on some petals that I'm making, the arc that you're doing is very shallow, and you maybe only have to do a short stitch every 3 or 4 or 5 stitches. This one, this petal is such an extreme arc, you know, from all the way over here, all the way around to this direction, plus it's a little tiny petal. I'm doing it, you know, a long stitch, a shorter stitch, a shorter stitch, and then an almost long stitch, and then maybe a long stitch, and then a shorter, almost long, and then a complete, you know, I'm doing it very frequently, in other words. But you just be the judge of that on, you know, whatever shape you're doing. But the more sharp the curve, the arc is, the more often you will need to do that. And as I get around here to the side, I'm still going to make a little short stitch. I want to fill all of that in. And I could maybe squeeze one more stitch in here. Probably didn't need that one, but it's there now. Okay. And you know, as far as the middle goes, first of all, it's a little tiny spot, but we're going to be covering that up here in just a minute. So it doesn't matter if that's neat or not. So on this particular petal, the center doesn't matter, but we want to pay attention to this outside shape here with a nice sharp point like that. So that's how you fit all those stitches into a little tiny narrow space down here in the middle of the petal. The next step for these little flowers is to give them a little shot of color. And I'll admit, when I first, you know, I had planned all this out, this whole design, I knew where I wanted to put each color, but as I got to stitching, you know, when I first started stitching these little flowers, I was like, I'm not loving it. There's something, I don't know, it just didn't feel, I wasn't sure the colors were working together, because they're pretty disparate colors, right? With this kind of purple and orange. I mean, purple and orange work great together, but I don't know, it just wasn't feeling quite right until I decided to put in a little strand of green, a little shot of color on each petal. So this is one strand of the lightest green. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to just do 3 little stitches. One, a longer one coming straight out from the center, and then one on this side and one on that side. So I'm going to start just like you do with needle painting. I'm going to come up inside this stitching, and I'm going to come way out to the point. You might be thinking, golly, that's almost to the very point, but trust me, when you pull it up and go down, when you pull it this way, it gets buried enough. So now it looks like it almost starts right there. And I brought it up right here. I don't know if you can see that in that much detail, but by the time you pull it, it kind of buries itself. So start out further than you think, because if I had started here, if I had come up here, then this little green little line would be here and it would almost be invisible. So come out, make those stitches longer than you think you'll need them, because they will get a little buried in those satin stitches. But anyway, I'm going to come on that side and make a little stitch, and come on up through there and on that side of the stitch. So do that for all 4 petals. And what, you know, it was so interesting to me. The minute I added this little bit of green, suddenly all these colors like harmonized. They needed, you wouldn't think that bright green, just a little bit of bright green would make such a difference with, you know, for the colors working together, but something about it, it just unified the colors. So this is obviously super simple. Just do this. I'll just finish this one out. Do this for each petal. And there you go, all done with that. The last little finishing touch on these flowers is to put 3 French knots right in the middle. And similar to satin stitch, French knots are one of those things that people, I call it kind of a love it or hate it thing. And generally, once you get the hang of it, you love them. And if you haven't gotten the hang of it yet, you hate them. But let me see if I can give you a couple of hints that will maybe make your French knots work. I know a lot of people struggle because it's like, I just can't get it to make a knot. And let me show you some of the things that will help them be successful. So I am using 3 strands, and I'm going to come up. All right, so here's the first thing. I'm going to hold these threads with my other hand. I'm going to put the needle and I'm going to wrap. Okay, so you can wrap 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. The more wraps you do, it gets a little trickier, but you can wrap multiple times and you can change the size of your knot. So you change the size of your knot by how many wraps and how many strands you use. So I'm using 3 strands, and I'm going to wrap each knot twice. Some people wrap towards them. I wrap away from me. It doesn't really matter. I would say just be consistent. Pick a way and do it. And once you get comfortable with it, you know, it'll work for you either way. It doesn't matter. But I wrap away from myself. So I'm going to wrap once and twice. All right, I'm still keeping, you know, my fingers right here. I'm going to sort of slide that thread back up the needle a little bit. I'm going to put the tip of the needle down, but I'm not going to put it exactly where I came up. If I put that needle down right in the exact same hole that I came up, when I pull this needle back through, it's going to pull the whole knot. Very well could pull the whole knot to the back of the fabric and it'll disappear, and you're going to wonder, why didn't it work? So that's one mistake that people make, is that when they put the needle back down, they put it back down in the very same place they came up. It can be just literally just 1 fiber over in your fabric, but just very, very close by. You don't want, unless you want a different effect, you don't want to go too far. So, all right, wrap once, twice, put the tip of the needle down right next to where you came up. Now here's another tip that I'm going to give you. Take this hand that you're holding and slide that knot to the end. So let me show you that again. Wrap once, twice. Okay, see how that knot is way up there? If I were to just let go and pull that needle to the back, that thing is going to get all messed up. If I control it a little bit, so now let me get that thread out of the way. So that knot is way up the needle. I'm going to slide it down to the fabric. I'm going to turn my angle my needle a little more straight, so I know it makes it harder for you to see, but I'm still going to hold a little bit of tension. I'm not, oh, let me back up. One other thing that makes it difficult for people. When you wrap it loose enough. You don't want to be pulling on this so tight that you're choking up these wraps so that it's just like super, super tight, because that's going to make it hard to pull that needle through. When you go to do this, and if those wraps are so tight, you can't even pull the needle through. So 1, 2. Needle down next to where you go. Slide that knot down. Because I left it loose enough, it will slide easily. I'm going to keep a little bit of tension right here with this hand. Sometimes I just put my finger down. All right, so now I can push that needle through. Now I'm going to pull it from the back, and I'm going to keep this finger here. Sometimes it makes for great reels when you just don't have a finger there, but it also can cause that thread to get a little bit tangled. I'm just going to pull. I'm pulling slowly so you can see what's happening. But right when it gets to the end, I let go, and now I have a perfect little knot with like a little hole in the middle, like a little spot in the middle. That's a perfect little donut. So now let me do the next one. I'll show you that again. That was a lot of yapping instead of stitching. So let me show it to you in real time. So I come up, 1, 2, go down next to where I want it to be, slide that to the bottom of the needle, pull it through, and there's my second knot. So you can see you don't necessarily have to pull that thread through at at snail's pace. You can pull it through pretty fast. Just sort of keep this finger on that thread so that in case it does get tangled up, this it'll kind of straighten the strands out under this finger. So let me grab another color of thread because I'm going to do one more French knot. I'm going to do it in this darker blue. So I'm going to come up right here next to those two. Same thing, 2 wraps, 1, 2, tip of the needle down, slide the knot to the bottom, hold it with my finger, pull the thread through, and there's my 3rd French knot. Hopefully those tips will make it more successful if you have struggled with your French knots. I want everyone to love French knots because they're just really cool, and you could substitute beads for French knots if you ever just want to, or just cannot learn to love French knots. That's fine too, but I say if you can try those couple of things, those techniques, I think you might be happier with your French knots.